Again, looking at some of these individual markets that are listed here, casual consumption on a Tuesday night at home is not the most common occurrence. So I think understanding how the end user is actually consuming your wine is important in terms of allocating resources in the way that's going to get you the strongest ROI.
I think, China, South Korea, and Japan, and to Singapore to some extent, you're going to have a little more opportunities for volume because the taxation isn't quite as intense as in those other markets as well.
Hey guys, welcome to this webinar session. I'm Patel, your host of this webinar. I'm the CEO of Beverage Trade Network. I have Bob here, Master of Wine, with me from California. I have Bree Stock here as well, who's the Master of Wine. Very pleased to have both of this amazing people with me. Great experiences. They've all sold or bought, for this market. They have been mingling with Asia for many years. So I think it's the first great experience stories we can also hear from you. And at the same time, you are really working, especially in the US, you can see what the feel is with the current scenario of Trump tariffs. So we can all agree that a little bit of attention is going back to Asia while people are looking to diversify again. This was all long term, but again, people want to sort of it reiterates the fact that diversification is a good solution. So that is also one of the reasons why I'm sure that attendees would want to listen to this call on. Let me just see what's playing with Asia, and let me just start as well there. So welcome. Why don't you both please, maybe we can start with Bree, give a little introduction about your experience and especially with Asia, please.
Hi, I'm Bree Stock. I am currently based in Oregon, but have history in Australia and also Hong Kong, and have been working with exporting to Hong Kong, South Korea, Japan, Singapore recently, and so expanding those export markets for clients and working with the Oregon Wine Board and Washington State Wines in export markets for both trade, education, but also working with importers and distributor and influencers in those markets to educate on the Pacific Northwest and California wines as well.
Bob, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bob Paulinski. I've been in the wine trade for more than 40 years. I'm an old guy. A lot of that time has been spent in the US and various leadership roles with some large companies, but I did work in Australia not too many years back, and I was responsible for wine sales in China back in that time. I currently have an import company. I'm doing some business in Southeast Asia. So I can speak to that in some detail a bit later. And I visited or traveled to many of these countries extensively. I have a lot of connections there. I've traveled there for both work and for leisure. And I think it's an amazing market, and there's certainly plenty of opportunity.
Fantastic. I'm just going to go and start with, let's say, why Asia, right? Like, why do you think we should pay attention to Asia, and what is your reason on why wineries should play with Asia?
So I do think that Asia is an important market for diversification for sales. They certainly have a very modern approach to wine now, which in the past it's been more of a traditional market for wine, including, the French classics, the Italian classics. But Australia and Chile have been quite aggressive in the Asian market for some time. And so they are familiar with a more New World style of wine as well. Where there is opportunity for US wineries is because they really do have, such a burgeoning middle class and ambitious wine consumer or more interest in expanding their wine knowledge. So I do think that is a sort of an exciting place for US wineries to start to look, because they haven't had as much attention from the US market. When you think about California is certainly present, but certainly more of the classics in California, Napa, Sonoma, and certainly the icon wineries, those that were in the judgment of Paris, et cetera, and some of the very big icon wineries. However, with Washington and Oregon being smaller markets and smaller production regions, they haven't really been exposed to as much of the Pacific Northwest wines. And there's certainly interest, especially with the trend for lighter styles of wine in certain markets as well. I guess traditionally they've been very focused on sort of the Bordeaux varieties. I guess Shiraz from Australia also has a pretty big place in these markets. But there does seem to be a lot of interest in both Korea and Japan for some of the lighter style wines, cool climate Chardonnay, cool climate Pinot Noirs, and then rosé, and even some more of the emerging trends like skin contact wines or more natural wines or sparkling pet nat canned wines as well.
Bob, what's your take on why Asia?
No, I think Bree has hit many of the main points. But look, I think you have a market where you have a very significant population. As Bree mentioned, you have a growing middle class. Wine oftentimes is perceived as a bit of a prestige type of product. And if you're into wine, it has a little bit of the persona that you've arrived. So there's a bit of this cachet that's attached to it. What I find when I travel through Southeast Asia, I find a younger clientele that's very engaged. If you go into restaurants, wine bars, that sort of thing, to me, it's really actually quite inspiring to see a good number of young people with wine bottles in front of them. So I find that there's a high degree of interest. I also think the learning curve there is extremely sharp. And over my time visiting there, which now is going over about a 10-year period, I think the thirst for knowledge and better understanding of wine is certainly there. There's a lot of education programs that have taken hold there that are gaining traction. So I think a lot of this is fueled through younger people. The other piece is when I look at the Asian market, it's extremely fragmented. And you can not only look at individual countries, but if you were in Hong Kong, for instance, I think you could find several very distinctive markets just within Hong Kong. So it's very fragmented in that regard. Now, Bree touched on something that I agree with 100%. French have certainly have a strong established foothold there. And if you look back over the last several decades, I don't think Sopexa is called Sopexa anymore, but there was a time when they really did lead the charge in that part of the world in terms of getting people engaged in wine. So in that regard, I think there's a bit of a head start for France. And also, to me, in many markets, there is really a desire for the classic wines, the prestige producers. I mean, this is really a lot of cachet attached to it. In many markets, you'll find that red wine consumption is much higher than anything else. I think in some markets, it might even be pushing north of 80%. I mean, it's significant. And if you visit retail stores in some of these markets, and I'll make reference to Kuala Lumpur, which I visit often, some of the stores are more than 50% Bordeaux. So Bordeaux and those Bordeaux varietals, there's a lot of interest. The other thing, and I think this is true everywhere around the world, there's always an interest in champagne as well. But I think those classic places of origin, and at the very least, the classic varieties that have some sort of connection to iconic places in Europe are the areas where you'll find most of the appeal.
These are just my pick, folks, right? So you can just give your opinion, and there is a reason why I wanted to pick this, which is a good mix of sort of a developed markets and then emerging. So when we did our research, the obvious were South Korea, Japan, and China, and Singapore. and then the two most high emerging, sort of fast growing culturally, we found were Thailand and Vietnam when it came to the hospitality scene developing, right? So, what's your take on, if people want to start, which are the five or six markets which you would start? Let's say everyone can have their different takes.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that from a developed perspective, I think you would look to go into South Korea and Japan because they do already have fairly mature structures for international imports and also a high level of market knowledge, and then also ambition in terms of, really trying to expand their wine knowledge as well. We certainly see a lot of engagement in both the trade and also a very heavy digital influencer market in those areas as well. And I think that, Thailand and Vietnam can be a little more challenging. They're certainly, I think, more premium. There's sort of a high luxury market potential in those markets, especially as the expat community continues to grow there as well. But I think the challenges there is the very complex tax structure and quite punitive tax structures, especially in Thailand, which depends again on some of the trade agreements that are in place with varying countries as well. So I think you would have a very different market approach with actually probably all of these markets. They're all very individual markets as to which to go into. So if you do have the opportunity to work with, a regional sales manager who has the time to spend developing and being specifically in these different markets where you might want to be spending, more time in Thailand, getting into the resorts and premium restaurants around the resorts, and really spending a lot of time in the sommelier or building that sommelier trade community for distribution and pull through. I think there's certainly the premium California has already been well received there, and then they're really starting to develop a lot more into the sparkling cooler climate Chardonnay as well. But again, it's a pretty challenging market for the taxes and that complexity. I think China, South Korea, and Japan, and to Singapore to some extent, you're going to have a little more opportunities for volume because the taxation isn't quite as intense as in those other markets as well.
And would you also classify them as fast growing, or they are pretty much mature like US, UK, or
I would say that South Korea is definitely still growing. I would say that Japan is quite mature in terms of their market. However, they certainly were more impacted during the COVID years, I would say, in terms of their growth. So I think they are on a rebuilding. So while they're a mature market, they have certain trends. They are very, attached to lifestyle, but also to organic, regenerative organic, and some of the, those sort of more farming environmental strategies that come into Japan, but also very classical and a mature market, but is certainly in the rebuilding process. South Korea, I would say, has been fairly well developed, and they're now starting to go beyond, just the sort of Bordeaux focus or Burgundy focus of wines, and they're actually starting to really embrace rosé, and sparklings are definitely on the rise, and more white wines as well. And then that's also in combination with, some of their importers are the largest, grocery or premium grocery chains as well. And they have their own sommeliers who are running, those programs. And so that's sort of way to be more in line in the sales channel, or sort of has a larger ability to get you more volume if you're into some of those larger larger premium importer stores, whereas the smaller importers are really focused on relationships with influencers, restaurants, and then smaller wine retail. So I think South Korea would certainly be, verging on a mature market at this stage, although they continue to learn and they continue to have just that appetite for growth and for understanding, and a curiosity towards wine. So I think they're, while a mature market, they're also still a market that is rapidly evolving. And then I think Thailand and Vietnam are sort of still at that emerging level, but because of the level of hospitality, and resorts in that area, that's where the opportunities lie, in Thailand and Vietnam. Bob,
Yeah.
what are you seeing in those markets?
Well, again, I don't want to be repetitive with what you stated, Bree, but I'll just say quickly, I do agree with Japan and South Korea being the most developed, Japan being more so. But the common factor that I'll find with all of these markets, and it may be a bit of an old school cliche line, but this is all about relationships. And it's a lot of being present, and being present with social media, public relation type events, being seen at wine fairs, engaging the community. It's important to have feet on the ground in these places. So it's not quite like doing business in the US where you might meet someone and you talk, you shake hands, you've got a deal struck. This tends to be drawn out over a protracted length of time. Again, looking at some of these individual markets that are listed here, in many cases, we're looking at countries that have a low consumption rate right now. And oftentimes, wine is a little bit more of something that is a special event, celebratory, gift giving, that sort of thing. Casual consumption on a Tuesday night at home is not the most common occurrence. So I think understanding how the end user is actually consuming your wine is important in terms of allocating resources in the way that's going to get you the strongest ROI. With some of these other markets, like Singapore, for instance, generally there you're looking at a very young population base. I think the average age there is like mid-30s, something like that. You have a lot of people who are they're engaged in some sort of office work, and we're talking a fairly small, restricted population in a limited piece of land, but the income there is very good. So you have this disposable income there that you're not going to find in some of these other countries to that degree. Also with Singapore, it really does give you a bit of a gateway into Malaysia. A lot of the population from Singapore actually will reside in Johor, just across the border. So, you might want to keep that in mind as well. As for places like Vietnam and Thailand, with a place like Vietnam, I think a lot of that business is really best focused towards resorts, expats, that sort of thing. I think that's probably the easier pathway. And the same with Thailand. Many of these markets will have small retailers, and these are almost like the old school type that you find in the US. You still do to some degree, but I'm talking 30, 40 years ago, where it was very much like personal interaction, a lot of one-on-one conversation, hand selling, that sort of thing. So I find that a good number of these countries, it's like old school retail. And it's not uncommon if you walked into a store in Thailand, for instance, the person in the store who greets you follows you around the store. And it may feel a little bit strange. The first time this occurred to me, I thought, okay, I know I look a little dicey, but I'm not here to steal anything. But it's the personal service thing. It's all about being engaged with that person that comes in the door. So in that regard, it's very old school, but I find it really a wonderful trait. China is an interesting one. When I worked in Australia, I was responsible for some trade in China. Obviously, a massive market. It's a very complex market. Things don't seem to go all that quick. So again, about having someone on the ground and being persistent. And it's always a good thing if you take some sort of course to understand a lot of the cultural type of of implications in these markets. Knowing that will help you to progress. Also in China, some of the retail there is really, it was quite an eye opener for me. I spent a good amount of time in Chengdu, and there we had struck a deal with a retailer there. And it was interesting being in the stores. The stores had surprisingly little foot traffic. And it really didn't occur to me until I became a little bit more in tune with what was going on. But a lot of the sales are done online, they're done with a phone. And there are thousands and thousands of scooters that are delivering product to high rise buildings. And the scooter arrives, the person goes in, drops it off with a concierge, and they're gone in just a few seconds. And that's how a lot of the business is done. So that tech element is really an important piece in some of these markets as well.
If I had to define an ideal customer of Thailand today, maybe it's a white wine, 35 years, what would that look like? Like, what is the main customer of Thailand? And then maybe a distribution model, one or two that you think is a working model, like how you said, pretty much most of them have a common models. Like you got to be on WeChat, for example, for China for sure, and you have to have D2C, omni-commerce, those kind of things. So just touch base on, what is traditional, what is completely everything, what is your ideal customer for Thailand, and what kind of 3 or 4 sort of trends you are seeing in Thailand, especially, when it comes to the next 24 months in growth.
I mean, I see in Thailand certainly wine consumption growing in that there's a growing middle and upper class market that is continuing to engage with wine more than other beverages, not so much beer and cocktails anymore. There is something aspirational about having an understanding of wine, and that sort of, I guess, more urban professionals are starting to, approach that wine from that angle. And of course, there's a big expat market there as well, from I think around the world now, where that semi-retirement age, as well as continuing consultants that are working in Bangkok, but also around the more tourist areas as well. So really, for long-term growth, I think you need to be working with those middle class and upper class Thais who are interested in exploring, the demand for wine. And that's often also still sweet wines or lighter wines as well, more sort of Moscato based. Or sort of aromatic based wine profiles. I think that there's a rise in those, also combined with that sort of, I guess, lower price point for these wines as well, gives them more access to the market. And then I would be looking primarily at luxury hotels and resorts. It depends on obviously your size of production and how much the price point of getting into the market there for some of these resorts. And a lot of these larger resort groups have already, global partnerships with wine brands or within portfolios as well. So I would suggest, looking at some of these larger resorts and hotels that do have more of a global approach to how they're procuring their wines for each specific market and who that head person to deal with is in those markets. And then higher end grocers, Villa Market and the Central Food Halls and that type of higher end grocery, where they also have, I guess, more of a D2C outreach as well, and they're able to engage with their regular consumers or their regular customers, but have a built-in D2C base in those markets. So as well as being the hand sell in the store, certainly developing more of an online community and building those D2C channels for building that local engagement are going to be some of the sort of entry points that I would be focusing on.
Are apps like banned there as well? Like all this, you can use, let's say, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, or other kind of apps for your marketing, or are there some other different sort of apps that the brand should be on them? And the second thing is, when it comes to the way people sell, like is it a traditional way where you walk into the store, a distributor's rep is going knocking doors, they have a route, how does the sales activations happen? Like how do you open a new door? Is that like UK or US sort of typical sales rep going in?
Bree's a tough act to follow. But I'll just say this. I do think the professional is really a good target there. Certainly the tourist aspect of it certainly is a primary play as well. For your question in terms of the apps, I mean, you're going to find a lot of the same apps that you're using here in the States. China certainly will be a different story. WeChat, there may be others that are used right now that I'm not in tune with, but understanding that certainly would be advantageous. In terms of how the sales are made, what I've seen with a lot of the businesses that I've interacted with, they're oftentimes part of a small chain. It could be a few stores. In some of these markets, you're not finding mega box stores. Some you will, in South Korea, you certainly will. But in some of these markets, they're more small corner shops. And the story of hand selling wine and one-on-one personal engagement, that sort of thing, that's still very common in a lot of these places. Third-party reviews is still something that is used there to a high degree. So if you have wines that have some sort of reviews from, and it's generally going to be a fairly small list of reputable sort of critics that'll carry weight, that's certainly going to be a plus. I have not seen, as you described, a wine rep going around old school and tasting wine. I mean, to me, what I'm seeing there, and Bree, maybe you know a bit more on this, but what I'm seeing is more of you have a curated assortment that a chain may focus on, and that's their range. Many of the wines that they'll carry will also be exclusive. We're in the US. If you have some sort of branded item, it's going to be spread far and wide. In many of these other markets, that's not the case. A retailer will have an exclusive on a branded wine. That's quite common.
So let's have our take on the Vietnam as well. If anything different there.
I mean, I think Vietnam, in terms of volume, is maybe growing a little more swiftly than Thailand is. They do have, again, that sort of young aspirational consumer base that seems to be growing as well. And maybe a sort of untapped market here also. So you could have a lot more luck, getting into these influencers and working with some of these influencers in Vietnam a little more to continue to grow your volume. I think also just having, some also accessible pricing, and maybe also, half bottles or things that are going to be able to work with the smaller boutique shops, and also have a D2C model, within some of these boutique wine shops, to build out an education model with your brand. Or if you are, looking from the US, how are you differentiating yourself from the more traditional, wine regions? Developing a more of a focus on, your conversation around sustainability or organic farming practices, and sort of that, more innovative model, as opposed to a strictly traditional wine approach with some of these younger aspirational consumers that are, very heavily influenced by a lot of social media trends as well.
Sorry, one naive question there for both of you. Like, can you have multiple importers? Is that a normal thing, or it's you prefer one importer for the whole country, or you can have a chain directly buying and then importer selling to bottle shops, or a restaurant group or resort directly acting as an importer? So what's sort of a standard practice when it comes to, let's say, both Thailand, Vietnam, when you're setting your distribution network?
I'm sure there can be a lot of exceptions to this, but what I've seen in these markets is an importer will generally they'll represent it, and I don't see it oftentimes being fragmented. That may be the case, maybe with some Bordeaux, that sort of thing, but I haven't seen that. The other thing I'll mention in these markets, you look at what's happening in the U.S. and there's a development of a lot of like private label, that sort of thing. I haven't seen much of that at all in Southeast Asia. It's much more branded, and the focus is again on those brands that have some sort of prestige or cachet attached to them.
What about like language? Do you think that a translator is a must if you want to operate and a multilingual, like who knows a couple of languages like Vietnamese or mainland China and all that? And then when it comes to marketing, like do you have to prepare completely English and then the local language and then attack, or what's your take on all that stuff like language, marketing, translation? How far you can go just with English?
I think in China, you need to have translated labels and translated tech material, tech sheets and things like that. It's a lot more important. But from my experience in the other markets, working with your importer and distributor is sufficient for translation. In at larger events, there's certainly translation provided, but I don't think it needs to be an essential from a producer perspective.
So when you want to build
Yeah.
your own end-to-end marketing, consumer engagement, you think I think anyway we're you want to focus on the English-speaking, sophisticated professional anyway there, right? That's the ideal customer that may know English.
Keep in mind, in some of these markets, English is quite common. I mean, if you were traveling in Malaysia, for instance, and you were in any major market, you were in Kuala Lumpur, Penang, Ipoh, most everyone speaks English. And when you get outside of those metropolitan areas in some of these countries, there's not a whole lot of wine market to be going after, other than maybe a handful of resorts here or there. So in many of these countries, I don't find the language barrier being a major obstacle. I think the focus on understanding the cultural piece of it and the messaging, the language, the tone, that sort of thing, I think that's really important. You can put your best effort forward, and if it's not resonating with that audience because the delivery is off, well, you're not gonna land with a solid end result. China, I think, is a different story. I agree with that. Completely different story. Sorry, one other point, and I know we've got a lot of moving pieces going on now with tariffs and all, but I think you should also understand the competitive market within each of these countries. Some of these countries will have free trade agreements with wine producing countries. So that may put you potentially at a disadvantage. So understanding the competitive landscape is always a good thing.
Does this agreement sort of come and go like we've seen in China, Australia? Like what happened with I don't know much about, let's say, South Korea or Thailand or Vietnam, or have they been permanent? Like I know that Thailand signed something with Argentina, but is that just like 2 year thing, or can people make long-term decisions on that?
Well, I mean, anything like this is subject to change if,
Yeah.
some geopolitical things going on behind the scenes. Now, I believe with Vietnam, I don't know if this is still in place, but they did have an agreement with Australia and Chile, and it was essentially a free trade agreement. I don't know if that's still in place. And
I believe it is. Yeah.
as you mentioned with China, there was this tariff situation that played out with Australia. Well, there was a period of time where Chile filled a lot of that gap. Over the last couple of years, Chile's business in China has tanked. So there's an ebb and flow to these things, and but my point is just understanding what's going on in that particular country at that time is going to put you in a better position to make strong business decisions.
Got it. Let's also touch base on the cultural things, right? Like my experience have personally, our team, it's as you know, it's very patient game there, and sometimes you lose patience for earning like literally nothing. You will end of the day just say it's just not worth it, and you will move on after 3 years. And when you see just like half a pallet or a pallet or half a container movement, I'm sure you have seen some good stories that where patience did pay off. So, maybe you can add a little bit on that when it comes to how do you work with importers and distributors there? What are those things like having gambe or having, dinners and what are those things? What does that cultural meeting look like, when it comes to this market?
So this all goes back to the cultural practices. This is going to vary by place, but I'll tell you this: in China, I spent plenty of late nights in Chengdu doing hot pot and absurd amount of drinking and being up before the crack of dawn to start the next day. So,
Mm,
some of that plays out, and it's just part of the cultural experience. So this is why I keep saying understanding what that is before you go in is going to prepare you for how things may play out. In China, there's a formality in terms of how these business meetings play out,
mm.
and understanding that and being aligned with it is going to put you in not only a good place in terms of having a business meeting go smooth, but it reflects well that you've done some due diligence to actually understand the cultural nuance of a place.
One of those things is, let's say you speaking at least hello, hi, good morning in their language. Do you think that sort of thing, right? Like that you're putting in serious effort or no?
Well, but that's almost like a common courtesy that you can find anywhere around the world. I wouldn't say that's so unique to the
Got it.
countries that we're speaking to, but there are certain customs. And in some places, there's again this formality in terms of the way business is transacted. And knowing that and being in tune with it really is going to reflect on you in a positive way.
Got it. Sorry, I'm moving here and
I'm,
there because I wanted to cover a few things, but we can stick to South Korea as well again.
I'm not sure I can provide a tremendous amount of value here, uh, but you do have a lot of consumer spending here, and there's an untapped potential, no doubt. Some of the things that Bree mentioned earlier, I think there is more of a developed demand beyond what you'll find in many Asian countries. As I mentioned, in many places, it's very traditional, prestige type driven, primarily red wine, and it's red wine it's more of a deeply extracted sort of red. In South Korea, I think it's more of a different story. I think they're more receptive to a broader range of items, experimenting. I think New World wines have a better chance of really getting into the mainstream there.
Got it. Bree, have you had experience there?
Yeah, I mean, I see a lot more, lot with their distribution channels are quite a large player. But I do also see a growing younger consumer audience there, and also in the trade as well. They have they're very aspirational. They have a high number of Michelin restaurants, even knowing from a just from a market trade perspective, when, California shows up in the market to do, a capstone course and to educate trade there, and same with Oregon or Washington, there's a very large turnout of committed professionals, both wine educators, but also wine buyers, and also this upcoming influencer who are also attending these tastings. And I think back to a week last year, I can't remember what month it was in, but there was California 2-day educational event that was fully packed and had both educators and producers there. And Oregon, Washington with master classes and walk around trade tastings and then dinners afterwards. And also at the same time, Bordeaux and Champagne and Argentina, I believe, was there as well. And these were all events that people were stacking into their day, to attend each event. So there's a very engaged trade consumer there. And that just speaks to me of, if you're putting in your relationship, building these relationships now, this can only be a continually growing market, for your brand. And I think, because I think Australia and New Zealand and the US share a lot of similarities in sort of being innovative, being approachable wines, but also working with the classic varietals. I think that they are gaining a lot of traction outside of these more traditional. They are sort of following, the consumers there are sort of following the trends in the US and in Australia of sort of drinking younger, drinking fresher producers. They're not necessarily following the classics and the icon producers as much anymore. And also keep in mind that Australia has a free trade agreement with South Korea as well. So there's a lot more presence of, I was quite surprised by how many sort of smaller, cool climate, even natural wine producers were in the South Korea market from Australia. And I think that is only an opportunity for other regions like New Zealand and the US who have similar styles, because that fan base is already being built with this sort of brand presence of innovation and sustainability and health conscious wine producers, and environmentally conscious wine producers as well. So I think there's a huge opportunity for continued growth in South Korea at the moment, and I would expect that to continue.
I think after COVID, China lost a little bit of trust, maybe globally, and now it's going back normal again, right? Like we got to go back again to the China. I don't know, maybe, but you can just give me your take. And then a couple of other points you can add is this word you've been using a lot today, Bree, especially educator and influencer. So maybe you guys can just tell, instead of a brand ambassador title that you show to your customers, do you agree that you rather have a Asia ambassador or an influencer that you work with closely who can keep focusing on developing those two channels?
Yeah, Sid. I mean, just a quick answer on that. I think it's a given. I mean, it's the way that you connect. So having that individual, I think, really does bring value. Specific to China, one other point that may be worth calling out. When I was doing some work there, we oftentimes modified packaging for the market. And oftentimes it meant bringing in red and gold colors into a label, that sort of thing. These kind of things, resonate with that specific market. So again, when I talk about understanding the cultural aspects within a market, this can help you to break down some barriers. So that piece of it, I think, is very important. And also within the Chinese market, if you're more in that prestige type of category, you need to be aware of counterfeit wines. I mean, it's something that really is far and wide. I've been to fairs there, and it's borderline flaunting it. So you just need to be aware of that as well. So if you do have some sort of very high-end prestige sort of wine, any type of measures that you can take to protect your brand equity and to make sure that wine, that image is maintained to its fullest is really a critical aspect there.
Bree, do you think China is again picking up traction?
I do. I think that, the traditional China market of gifting and classics and icons, I think that is still strong in many areas, but I do think that they still have that burgeoning middle class that is really engaging with red wine still specifically, and I think more Bordeaux varieties as well. Bringing in celebrity or, some of those influencer connections, I think is really important to the younger consumer here, and to that, continuing to build that aspirational younger consumer as well.
Asia, when it comes to the current context, which is the tariffs and the geopolitical, I would say uncertainties. How do you think? What's your take on? Do people should start at least visiting fairs or conducting meetings? Is it worth looking at? What's your take on the current situation and comparing with your context with Asia, please? Maybe Bree, you can go ahead if you want.
I think I would say this whether I'm talking about developing, relationships and channels in Asia or in Europe. I think currently it's an unknown situation. So I think that these markets will always be here and continue to grow. And so I think that still taking the opportunity to invest here where it makes sense. If you're regional associations, whether it's Wine Australia or, California, the Wine Institute, if they are doing education or trade visits to market where you can, latch on to these activations at a good price, I think it definitely makes sense to continue to build the story, to continue to engage and build relationships. At the moment, we don't know how long these tariffs are going to last. Australia saw a dip when, they lost their free trade agreement with China, but that's fully back now. The same, I think when Bob said earlier, it's about relationships. I think continuing to build relationships will help you get through a lot of the pain in some of these tariff situations. But yeah, you need to be realistic about your pricing as well and understand where your pricing is going to work in these markets. So being fully aware of the amount of tax and duty depending on which region you're going into is really going to, I think, prioritize where you're going to focus your growth in these Asian markets.
The only piece I would add to this is it's generally a very long play. So, I would not expect something to happen immediate. It's about that constant contact, support. It's traveling to the market. There's a lot of due diligence involved here. The potential is certainly there, but business is done in a very different way. And understanding that is critically important.
So I think one question final for both of you. If I don't export to, let's say, UK or one of the Germany, and then there is Asia, do you think I should still go and start focusing on UK or Germany or Asia? Like if I just could select one, where would you focus on today? If I was a winery, I have to open a new market and I have still not opened in Germany, UK or Asia.
That's a curveball, Sid.
Yes, because end of the day, people have limited budget and limited time, right? So I just want to make sure that is it still important than Germany or UK if you're not there?
My thought on this would be you have to understand where your wine fits in the marketplace, what the competitive set is, and then you do your due diligence in terms of, okay, what are my barriers of entry into various markets? How much input do I need to put in terms of getting an ROI? I mean, then it just becomes a business case. You have a limited amount of resources. Where do you spend the time and effort?
You got to have an ROI with your effort. Do you think is it comparable to Germany and UK?
I was going to say, I think they're probably very similar growth strategies and conversations. For instance, speaking from a very personal perspective, I am only exporting currently to Asian markets.
Interesting.
I mean, the interest in my style of wines at the price point that I'm at has more growth currently in Hong Kong, South Korea, and Japan than currently, in Germany. The UK and the Nordic markets are certainly different, but given what's happening from the global market perspective at the moment, there's certainly a pause on these products from European importers and Nordic importers at the moment. So for now, my focus will remain on Asia, with an eye to where can I spread myself. At the moment, I already have exports developed and relationships developed in the Asian markets. So for now, that's where I'll stay until maybe the current trade situation changes. But I think all of these are going to be slow growing markets. If you're a US company, depending on price point and your established brand presence already as well. It takes time in any of these markets.